Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today we're in the third and final and most enjoyable section of this little review slider project, which is the JavaScript. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And if you've seen this before, you know you can slide and jump between these. We're going to dynamically generate all this with JavaScript, and that's what I'll show you how to do here in just a second. Now, if you want to follow along, you can come over here to Coding in Public, the GitHub here, and just navigate to the right branch here, lesson 3 starting point. And then you can go ahead and just download the zip here and open it yourself. Of course, you can fork it. You can also just clone the whole thing if you want, but I'll leave you to that. Let's go ahead and jump in then and work on the JavaScript. Now, the first thing we'll need to do is come up top here, and let's go ahead and link to our JavaScript file that we're going to create here. I'll do script src here, and then we'll just call this reviews.js. And in order for this to load after the body loads, we do need to add a defer attribute here. So defer just like that. And then let's come in here and let's add that. So we'll say reviews.js. Now if I open it up here and I say console.log a hi or something like that and open up the console, it should say hi. Okay, so everything is properly working. Now before we do too much, let's go ahead and think through the steps of what we're going to need to do. First of all, we want to fetch the data from our API, which is just going to be that data JSON document. I'll show you that in a second. Secondly, we want to parse that data and create those individual review divs. Last time we stacked them up here and just added them directly to the HTML so we could style it. We want to populate each of those once we've fetched the data. And then finally, we want to add event listeners to move the slider left or right depending on which button that we've clicked. So let's first of all go ahead and look at our data and kind of see what we have got going on here. So we've got this reviews.json, which is essentially mimicking an API endpoint. You'd fetch this from some server somewhere, and it would have IDs, perhaps, of the reviewers, their names, where you could find their headshots, stars, location, all that kind of stuff. So this is the content we're going to be parsing through when we fetch it in JavaScript. Now back in our JavaScript file here, let's go ahead and write a little fetch statement. Now I've got this kind of populated already in my code editor just to make it quicker, but I'll just walk you through it here. We've got an async keyword here, which allows us to control the timing with this await keyword. Then what we're doing in here is we're fetching something, some URL, which I'll show you how to do that in a second. We're getting a response. As long as we got it, it just keeps moving down this chain where then we've chained on this data from response.json. So we were getting the response, converting it to JSON, and now we're ready to do stuff with it. If there's a problem, it'll throw an error, and we can move forward with that. Now I'm going to go ahead and rename this here, grabbing both of those with Command D once I've selected the first one, and I'm going to call this fetch reviews, just like that. Now you can grab any URL here. In this case, we've got reviews.json. That's the file that we just looked at. Now let's go ahead and come down here, and we're just going to console.log the data that we got in. And if I do that, you'll see we've got 6 items here in this array, and there are 6 people. All right, so we've got their body, headshot, ID, location, name, stars for each person. Well, what do we want to do with this? Well, if we come back over here, the next step was to parse that data and recreate the review divs. So let's go ahead and let's move this up here, and we're going to parse it right here. So what we'll do is take the data itself, and then we're going to map over that data and pass every single item in that to a function that we'll call load reviews. So let's do that. Let's jump up top here. We'll declare the function up top and say function load reviews. And here it's going to take in a review. And then let's just console.log the review. All right, and then let's get rid of this console data here. And if I refresh once again, now it should look very similar, except they're all broken up into their own little objects here, because that's what's being passed in here is an object. Now we can access each property in this object with the dot notation. So if I said reviews.name here, or review.name, and refreshed it, now we're just getting the names. Or I could say review.id, and we would just get that. What that means we can do is we can very quickly just create a bunch of HTML here in a string. So just so we can see what's going on here, let's console.log, and then we're going to add a string in here with backticks. Now what will this string look like? It's going to look just like the HTML over this way. So let's go ahead and grab one of these reviews right here, and then I'm going to copy it, and I'll paste it in right here. Because I added this inside backticks, I can go ahead and use template strings here and just grab each of those items. So I could say review dot headshot, which is what that item, that property on that object that was passed in is called. Then in this alt here, we're going to name it the person's name. So again, I would come in here and say review.name. Now for each of these, I'm not going to make you watch me do them, but we'll come in here and for each of them, we'll just grab the item we need from that object. If you're not sure what's in the object, you can open the JSON file. But let me do this quickly and I'll be right back with you. I've gone ahead and done all that and I saved it here, and you see I'm just getting this big string for each of them of HTML. Now you might be confused because we've got this review stars section, and in our JSON file, they all have different star settings, so like 5 or 4.5. What we need to do is dynamically generate that image depending on what they've selected, 4 stars, 5 stars, 4.5 stars, whatever. So what we're going to do is, instead of replacing that with just the stars itself, we're going to actually write another little function. So this is the review stars div, and inside here we're going to write a function that's called load stars, and we're going to pass it our review.stars. So let's jump up top here. We now need to write that function. So that function will be function review stars. It's going to take in however many stars that they have passed in. Let me save this, open the sidebar, and let's jump into our images here to show you what we've got going on. I've got a half star, I've got a full star, and then I've got an empty star. I grabbed these all from Phosphor Icon, so there's my empty star, there's my half star, and then I also generated one myself and just basically duplicated this half and made a fully empty star, and then I changed their color. And if I jump over this way, you'll see instead of setting that in the CSS, I went ahead and just changed it myself, and they all share this same HSL value. You can just grab these from the repo if you want, or you can do your own stars if you want to. But what we're going to do is use those 3 different SVGs and style our section here with SVGs, and depending on what they've selected, we will basically populate with like 3 full ones or 3 full 1/2, whatever it happens to be. We're going to add an empty array at the very top called calculated stars, like that, and we'll set this to an empty array. Now you might be saying, why are you using a const? You can't update a const. Well, it's true that we can't update this declaration, but we can actually change the value that it points to. That's because it's in an array here. We just can't change this. If that's confusing for you, I just recommend looking up const and how that works differently with strings versus arrays and things like that. Now what we're going to do is create several little for loops, and for each of these we're going to loop through and decide basically how many, first of all, how many full stars there should be, secondly, how many half stars, and then finally how many empty stars, because that's the order we would want them to populate in. We'll say for, and we're going to say let I equals 0, and then next we're going to say as long as I is less than math.floor stars. So in other words, if it's 3.5 stars, that'll be 3 full stars, right? So that's what we're doing by the math.floor. And then we're going to say, go ahead and increment each one of those. So if there's 3.5 stars that are passed in up here, it's going to use 3 as the calculation here. It'll say as long as there's less than 3. So the first time through, it'll be I will be equals to 0. What we're going to do is push in to that array that we had up top. So we'll say calculated stars.push, or what we're going to push in is HTML here of just image. And then what we're looking for is our images.full.star.svg. So we're pushing in some HTML as an item in this array. So what is it doing here? It's saying the first time through it's equal to 0. So that's less than the stars that were passed in, the .floor stars. So it'll say, all right, well, I'll go ahead and add 1 to the array. Then it comes back up, and now I is equal to 1. It does it again. And now it comes back up, I is equal to 2. It does it again. Now it's done it 3 times, which means it's the maximum we want it to be. And then it'll skip down and keep going. So after that, we're going to say if stars is equal to 5. In other words, if we already know that all 5 of them are stars, we can go ahead and jump out of the rest of this. So we'll say return calculated stars.map. So we're going to use another map here. So we will just take each item in that array of calculated stars, and we'll just pass it back out and then join it with all the other ones in a long string with no separators, just like that. So that's what we're going to return down to load stars. If I save this and jump back over here, I have a problem that you've probably been screaming about. All right, and that is that this is load stars and this is review stars. Let's try this now. If I save it here, you'll see that on some of these, I actually have full stars. So Looks like whoever this is, Presley Muller, thought we deserved 5 stars. So it adds all 5 there. If I come up here though, some of these won't have all 5 stars. So this says undefined. So we know that we need to do a little bit more work for some of these. So we've looped out early if we already have 5 stars. What's the other options? Well, we might have something that's a whole number like 4 stars or 3 stars. So we don't need to worry about the half star at that point. So how do we check for that? Well, we can see if the number that we've passed in is an integer. So we'll say number.isInteger. We'll pass in stars. So we're saying, hey, is it a whole number? If we don't have 5 full stars, is it at least a whole number? If it is, then we'll use the same for loop. Let's just grab this right here. And we'll say for, and in this case, we want to compare it to what we know, which is the full star amount, 5 stars, minus however many stars we've passed in. So if it's 4 stars, we now only want it to loop through 1 time. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the empty star. So if it's a full integer here, then we're going to grab however many stars that are full, and then however many single stars that are empty. If it's not an integer, then we know there's there's only 1 half star. So we come in here and say else, if this is not the case, let's go ahead and take calculated stars. And we're going to push onto that our half star. Remember, there's only going to be 1 of those ever. You don't have multiple half stars. That would be called a full star. So we could come in here and say this should be half star. Now, after we've pushed it, then we still need to do what's right here, these empty stars that are left over. So I'm going to copy this back down here. And in this case, we actually are going to say, hey, we want 4 stars minus math.floor. We could also do ceiling and not do 4. We could do 5 there, but this is just how I had written it originally when I figured it out. So that's what we're going to do here too. And again, this should be empty star. Now, once all that looping is done, because there weren't 5, we haven't returned out of it. We skipped over all this. So now we still need to return the stars. So let's go ahead and grab this here and we'll copy this down. We're going to do the same kind of return statement down below. That means if I save this, all of these should now work properly. And if I come in here, those all have stars, those have stars, there's no more undefined. Now, I don't really like viewing it down here. Why don't we get it up here in the UI? So to do that, let's go ahead and remove these reviews. I'll do that and be right back with you. Okay, so now we've just got an empty reviews div. If I save it, everything gets out of there, which is good. Now we've console logged this, but that's not really what we want to do. When we've loaded the reviews, we now know we're getting what we need. So what we want to do is just return this like this. So we'll return it here. So whenever we load reviews, it's returning from this fetch immediately. Now we're not actually capturing it in any kind of variable. So let's go ahead and do that now. We could add it to a variable directly here and then update the reviews div, but let's go ahead and just say document.querySelector. And then what we're going to do is grab reviews, which is our div that holds everything. And we're going to say its inner HTML needs to be equal to data.map, load reviews, etc. Now each of these reviews is going to be passed back as a string of HTML, and I just want to make sure I join them all again with nothing. Now if I save this and we did it all correctly, we should actually have these populating in here. Full star, this is not working. All right, let's see what we did wrong up this way. Another thing that you may have been yelling about, let's grab all these SVGs. It looks like we never added closing quotation marks there. Okay, so now they all populate. Because we still have the overflow hidden off, now you see them all coming this way. There's a 5 star, there's a 2.5 star, so you see that half star coming in, and then the extra stars afterwards. There's a integer one that has 3 out of 5, and then a 4.5. And then finally another 5 star for good measure. Okay, so if we remember our steps we were going to look at, we were first going to fetch the data, then we were going to parse the data. We've done both of those things. Finally, we need to add some event listeners. So let's come down here and give ourselves a little bit more space. Now we're going to grab each of those arrows separately. We set them each up to have their own ID, even though they share a lot of the CSS in that class. So this one was arrow right, and then we're going to add an event listener here. This event listener will be a click, and we're going to pass it to a function called move slider that we're going to write. Let's copy this down, and now we've got not just arrow right, but also arrow left. Now we're going to need to write this function or it's going to scream at us. Now let's go ahead and do that up here above the fetch, just to keep kind of all those normal functions together. So we're going to say function move slider. It is going to take an E, which is the event, because we just passed reference to it, the browser will go ahead and send the event along with it so we can access that to figure out which button that we clicked. So we'll say console.log e.currentTarget.id. So that way we can see which ID we've clicked on when we reload or when we click one of these buttons. So if I click here, property of ID of undefined, target. All right, target. There we go. Arrow left. Now, if we hadn't, last time we made sure we couldn't click on these SVGs by removing pointer events. So if we didn't do that, you could actually click on the SVG and it'd be trying to find the ID of the SVG with this current target. And so that's why I went ahead and just removed that. I think that would give us that error if I remember correctly. Okay, so we've got both of those. Now, what do we do with those? Well, we can write a little if statement to figure out basically which one that we've clicked on. Since they both call this exact same function, that's what we're going to need to do. So we'll say if e.targetID.includes, and we're going to say right. So if it just has that in the ID name, because they both say arrow dash dash either right or left. So if it includes that in the name, then we want to move the slide to the right or to the left. Now, we haven't yet set up any way to track which slide is currently in view. So let's go to the top here and declare a couple things that are going to help us. So we're going to have a couple of global variables. So we'll say let reviews. We're going to use that so that we can figure out what our full array is. And then we're going to say let slide index. Now this one we'll actually set to 0. And we can update this to show you what it does in a second. But in order to get our full array that we got back, the first thing we are actually going to need to do is set reviews here, because we declared it globally, we can access it here and update it to our data as well. So now if I were to go ahead and come up top here and let's console log reviews, just to make sure that I'm actually getting console log reviews, to make sure I'm actually getting a full array there. When I click on one of these buttons, I should get the full array that was passed in originally, which is good because then I know how many items are in it and all that kind of stuff. Also, I've got my item index, or index, slide index. Here we go. And it tells me if I click on any of these that it is 0. All right, either way, it tells me it's 0. Okay, so I've got a way to now track which slide I'm on. Now, if they click right, I could just say slide index plus plus. So I want to actually increment it to the right. So now I would be on 1 if we're tracking with where we've kind of been. And then I could say else slide index minus minus to decrement it. So that it'll move, let me come down here and let's go ahead and grab that reviews div that holds all these individual items, these individual reviews. So let's just query select and grab the reviews, which again is that div that holds everything, and we'll say .style.transform. We're going to translate it then, translate, and because I put this in backticks, again I can use a template string here, and I could say -100, that would be the percentage we're wanting to get here, times the slide index. So 0 times 100 will be 0, so it'll be right where we want it to be. 1 times -100 will be 100% to the left. So it'll drag that whole div over, which will expose the next thing in its kind of flex children. Now I need to also add here, outside of here, a percentage sign and then a closing parenthesis. And if I save this here, you see nothing much changes. I could actually manually just switch this to like 2, and it should slide everything over. See, is that working? Oh, I have to click. I forgot because we hooked this up to the event listener. Let's come in here. If we click this way, it tries to go that way. We're going to fix that in a second. If I come back here, it's now incrementing those, and those are all stacked here behind it, which is what we'd want. But then eventually I'll get to the end here, and then it doesn't know what to do. So the problem is I need to figure out when I'm at the beginning or the end, and depending which button I'm pushing, actually change the slide index based off that. So let's come down here for our last thing we need to do. And inside here, we're going to write a little ternary, which is like a little if statement. So we'll say slide index, if that equals reviews, that's the whole array, remember, dot length minus 1, that gives me the last item in the array. If it equals that, then I just want to set slide index to now be equal to 0. Remember, I'm moving right, so if I know I'm the last one, rather than trying to find one beyond the last, go ahead and loop back to the 0 position. Now the dot length property will start at 1 and count up, so I'm going to have 1 extra since arrays are 0 indexed. That's why I've got to say -1 here. So I'll set it back to 0. Otherwise, I'm going to say slide index plus plus. So it's this, what I'm doing is I'm checking whenever I click right if I'm in the very last item. If I am, I loop back around to the beginning. If I'm not, I just keep incrementing until it forces me to loop back. That also means I can come down here, let's remove all that, and say when we're clicking left, if I'm actually on the first index, so index of 0, and it'll always be 0, I know that, then what I want to do is say review slide index is equal to reviews.length minus 1. And then again, here I'm not incrementing, I'm decrementing. If we did this correctly, as I click here, this should loop back to the very last item, and that's what it does. And if I keep going this way, it should just keep looping right around. That also means I can go this way, and when I hit that last item, it should loop back to the beginning. That leaves us one more thing to do. All we have to do is come over here and remove this overflow hidden. And now that is a complete project. Fully responsive, cool little design here with this gradient shadow. You can click this way. You can also use your keyboard arrows and just hit the space bar or the enter key, and it will loop right through them as you'd like. You can jump back to the other one and do the same thing. I hope this was helpful for you, and having to load this as if it were like from an API endpoint and doing all that kind of JavaScript, finagling data. I think just the more practice you get at that, the better it'll be, because that's really what a lot of front-end development is. It's taking data, manipulating it, and then interacting with it, letting the user interact with it. Well, I hope this was a big help. Thanks so much for watching. If you like these kinds of tutorials, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one. Happy coding.